Hi everyone. Today I'll be talking about land use and I'll be focusing mostly on cities. So when people are moving from the rural areas, like the countryside, as in the picture on the bottom here, to cities, that is called urbanization. Okay, so urbanization is the moving of people from rural areas to cities. And right now, countries in Africa and Asia, they have the largest growth with urbanization. And if we're thinking about why people are going to cities, it's because there are more job opportunities, education opportunities, and better healthcare. So there are pros and cons to both. Pros and cons to urbanization, pros and cons to living in a rural area. We'll focus on urbanization. So the pros, easier to provide education. That's because there are more schools available. Pollution comes mostly from point sources, and a high population of people will lead to higher tax money, higher tax revenues. So you might be asking, how is pollution a pro? So this part, it's a pro because we know it's from a point source. So a point source is when we can pinpoint, we can specify, we can isolate the source of pollution. So that would be a pro because if we know the source of the pollution, then we can take steps to solve the pollution problem. Cons would be that schools are overcrowded, and so there are more students per classroom. Pollution levels are going to be higher since population density is high. And then poor people in cities, they're going to utilize social programs, and that usually leads to the wealthier people moving out to the suburbs. So urbanization, that's when people are moving from rural areas to cities. There's something called urban sprawl. So urban sprawl is the spread of low density urban or suburban development outward from urban center. And causes for this, why people would want to move out from the city is because there's more traffic in the city. Usually in the suburbs, the price of land is going to be cheaper. Right? It depends where you live, but the further out you go, away from, let's say, LA, it's going to be cheaper. Newer suburbs, newer cities, newer towns are going to have improved infrastructure. Right? So they're going to have better cable, they're going to have better water mains and things like that. And then there's a rise in standard of living and a rise in population growth. So because people need a place to go. And this right here, I'll pause this in a second and show you. This is a video of urban sprawl in Las Vegas. This video is a time-lapse video of what happens with urban sprawl in Las Vegas. So Las Vegas, desert area, right? Desert area. This is back in 1984. And I'm not going to play the whole thing, but you can kind of see over time you can see there's more development and there's more land development. So there's more buildings, more hotels, more places of business, and it goes up until I think 2016. All right, so if I just fast forward to 2016, so 2016, you could see this is an example of urban sprawl, where before the city was a way smaller, and then over time we're just building outwards and outwards and outwards. So that's called urban sprawl. On the next slide, this is talking about zoning and urban growth boundaries. So when we had this urban sprawl, when we are moving our land outwards, in the US, we have a process called zoning. So the zoning is the practice of classifying areas for different types of development and land use, and it restricts usage of land to fit certain areas. So for example, in Arcadia, you wouldn't see a house next to a gas station, next to an apartment, next to another house. Like all the homes are in one region. All the shopping areas are in one region. Like apartments are in one region. So you have different zones and you have different regions of business, of residential areas. And this next link right here, where it's talking about urban growth boundaries, this is a regional boundary and it's set in an attempt to control urban sprawl. So urban sprawl is going to happen. And once you have, let's say, the city of Portland, okay, so Portland over in Oregon, up north, a lot of people want to move to Portland because of the accessibility to nature. But because people want to move to Portland and there's not enough space, they're going to have urban sprawl. But then they have to decide, where do we want to draw that boundary? Where do we want to draw that line where we can keep nature as nature and have people live in a certain region? So if you wanted, you could take a look at this to give you more information. So with urbanization, with urban sprawl, you're going to have a lot of land development to preserve some of nature, to preserve some of the nature, how it is, or maybe even restore parts of nature. There's a few vocab words to know. One is called greenbelt. So greenbelt, it's a policy and land use designation that's used in land planning, land use planning to retain, so to keep some of the areas that are of largely undeveloped wild or agricultural land surrounding or neighboring urban areas. So this is a way to keep either agricultural land or wild land or undeveloped land in urban areas. And a greenway, these are going to be strips of land that will connect parks or neighborhoods. These are often located along rivers or streams or canals, and they could provide access to a network of walking trails. So a greenway, this is a strip of land that will connect parks and neighborhoods. Examples over here on the bottom here, this is the Chicago River. So the Chicago River, before, it wasn't necessarily the safest of places to walk around, but recently they've remodeled that area, right? Developed that area. So now there's patches of green. So this is a park. People can walk along the river, right? They can walk along the river. And then over here on the right for the LA River. And so LA River right now, what they're trying to do, and I'm going to pause the video in a second, is they want to have this LA River as a place where people can walk. So they want to bring back nature and they want to bring back parks. And then also at the same time, you can have business there. And so people will stop to eat along the river. So when you think of the LA River, this is what you might picture. And so this is what we typically think about the LA River to be. But eventually, the goal is to revitalize it, right? To bring back the birds, to bring back the ecosystem by restoring some of the land, and then also create a recreational area for people to visit. And another example of a greenway is New York's Highline Park. This is an old railroad area where nobody was using it anymore, and then they ended up changing it where now it's more of a tourist attraction. It's a place for people to walk and to do some people watching. So this is just part of the clip of this video, and you can see that people here can sit on benches, can watch traffic, can do people watching, and it's a tourist attraction. And not only that, but you can also walk along this. So they took out the train tracks, the railroad tracks, and then they paved it, and then they planted some wild flowers over here, and then people can just walk. So this is another example of a greenway. So now that we have our urban sprawl, we have to find a way to connect everything together, and we came up with the federal highway system. So we received federal funding, but this is built and controlled by the states that the freeways are located in. And many people use these freeways to commute to work. We use these freeways as a source of transportation or a source to move and distribute goods as well. So the environmental impacts of highways. There's less pollution since cars don't constantly stop while driving on the highway if there's no traffic. It helps reduce congestion on the streets, and it lowers the amount of carbon dioxide emitted because the cars are moving more efficiently. There's better gas mileage. It helps the economy since interstate highways, they return about $6 for every dollar invested. So what does that mean? That means that for these freeways, you are able to drive to work. And you're able to drive to work, you're able to make money for your city. And then even in the city, when you're there, you're also probably going to spend money in the city because you need to eat lunch or maybe grab dinner. And it also allows goods to reach destinations around the country relatively quickly. So we're talking about land. We talked about the Bureau of Land Management in the previous Google slides, but once again, Bureau of Land Management, or BLM, They manage 262 million acres of land. So that's about 1/8 of the land in the United States over here. And most of the land that they own is in the western part of the states. They manage energy and minerals. They manage, timber, forage, fish and wildlife habitats, wilderness area, and historical sites. And with this land, there's also national parks. So there are over 1,100 national parks in the world. And people visit the parks all the time, but they can also disrupt the natural functions. So with that, there are some guidelines, some rules and regulations, some ways to decrease land disruption so you're not destroying nature. So you can ban off-road vehicles. So there's going to be areas where you're not allowed to drive. You can provide tax incentives for property owners near the park. So tax incentives, you can have like a tax break. Right? You can have a discount type of thing. And then for property owners near the park, they can help take care of the land. That would be their incentive. So they can get some money back. You could provide education programs to the public. So we know for land disruption, you're not supposed to pick the flowers there. You're not supposed to take the rocks and the gravel that you see there. You're supposed to leave the land undisturbed as is. You're supposed to, you could also limit the amount of people visiting the park each year. Right? And then in the Barron's text, you can see more examples for that. Wetlands is another example of land use right now. So these are areas that are covered with water. They have rich animal and plant life. They have a lot of biodiversity. But right now, I think about 90% of the wetlands in U.S. are destroyed. Here it says half of the wetlands in the U.S. have been destroyed. I want to say in the Barron's book, I think it's 90% or so, with most of them either converted to farmland or to cities. But wetlands are important because they purify water. They do these ecosystem services for us. They reduce damages from storms. They reduce the chance for floods. And there are a few types of wetlands that you should know that's in the Barron's book, so take a look at that. And the main problem right now is we are just turning these wetlands into farmland because also this is very rich in nutrients. And here are some laws to be familiar with. There's the Wilderness Act, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and the Food Security Act. So with these wilderness areas, there are some areas that are untouched by human activity. So we preserve it, where we do not allow humans to go in there because we want to keep nature as is. So here are some examples: the swamps of the Southeast, tundra of Alaska, the peaks of Rocky Mountains, the forests of the Northeast, and the deserts of the Southwest. And the largest wildlife reserve is the Arctic Wildlife Reserve. I just wanted to show you a picture of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. I think I said reserve earlier. But ANWR, this is the largest one in the US. And it says here it's one of the most pristine, undisturbed places on Earth. So you need a permit, I believe, to be able to go to various places. But it's not usually open to the public where they could just go anywhere they want. So this is just an example of how you can conserve the land where you just designated as a refuge, wildlife refuge, where nobody can actually build on it. But right now there is a desire to possibly drill for oil, but that's probably going to be in a different Google slide. And then here, one more time, talking about land conservation. So we want to preserve the land. We want to keep the land as is. We can maintain the land. We need help from nonprofit organizations. Example over here would be, let's say you have a forest. Okay, so this is a forest in the Chicago suburbs, and to the right here is a bicycle trail. So you could bike through the forest, but the forest itself is preserved. Over here, this is an example of a dam where looks like they're trying to break down the dam to restore the rivers how it normally was meant to be. And then over here on the bottom right, it looks like these are different ways that you can clean up after an oil spill. So with land conservation options, this is also in your Barron's textbook, there's something called preservation. So to preserve just means to keep or maintain. Right? Remediate. Remediate is to correct a fault or deficiency. So over here, with the previous slide, this would be to preserve. Right? So preservation. And then Over here on the bottom right, this would be an example of remediation. So there's an oil spill. How could you fix it? And then mitigation. Mitigation is to moderate or alleviate in force or intensity. So, for example, I think we watched the before the flood video with South Florida with sea level rising. In terms of their way to solve it, their way to mitigate the problem was to put in pumps. Over here, one way to mitigate the problem of flooding is to put sandbags. And so this would be an example of mitigation. So you're alleviating the damage it's doing, but you're not necessarily fixing the problem. So to remediate, again, would be to fix the problem. And then the last one, restoration. Restoration is to bring back to its former condition. So that would be something like this, where you would take down the dam. The LA River, you would take out the concrete and let a river be a river. I think that is it. All right, thank you for listening.